So welcome to anybody on Catch Up. I'm going to start with a question this morning, and that question is how did Jesus start his ministry? It's a rhetorical question, really, but I don't know if any of you can think about how he started his ministry. And I guess if you consider his baptism by John at the Jordan, his commissioning, when he received the Spirit, and the Spirit comes down like a dove. That's his commissioning to ministry. He'd spent 30 years doing nothing. Well, not doing nothing, but in the carpentry shop or whatever he was doing. But no renowned ministry, and then it sets off. And what happens is then he spends 40 days in the wilderness or the desert or the lonely place, depending on how you translate the Greek. But he goes off for a month and a half on his own. That's not the way I'd choose to start ministry, I have to say. But it's the way Jesus did it. Now, I know there was the temptations and all the rest of it, but that seems to be Jesus' modus operandi of ministry, that he would frequently take himself off on his own, even when he was popular, as we'll see. So, whoopee, whoopee, hallelujah. I hear hallelujah. We're going to do silence and solitude this morning. At least, well, the introverts of us might think, yay. The extroverts probably think, but anyway, we're going to think about silence and solitude. So let's do some readings. So this is Luke, and actually this comes after a bit in verse 15. Luke talks about how all the crowds came to Jesus and his ministry was really taking off. And he says, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Often. This is how he works his ministry. So I'm guessing if that's how Jesus did it, probably I need to learn to do it too. And then this is the well-known passage of Elijah when he's burnt out and gone to the wilderness himself. And the Lord comes and he says, the Lord said to Elijah, go and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. And then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart, shattered the rocks before the Lord, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face, went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? And you notice that when there's a wind, there's a lot of noise. When there's an earthquake, there's definitely a lot of noise. Fire, pretty noisy when it's burning, certainly in the way that I imagine it there. But the Lord isn't any of that. He's in the very silent, gentle whisper that it needs silence and solitude to pick up. And then, this gave me an excuse to do a quote from Lamentations 3. I mean, who wouldn't be there? But anyway, this is it. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him. To the one who seeks him, it is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It's good for a man to bear the yoke while he's young. Let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Wow. Okay. So let's think about some definitions. I mean, you might think, well, okay, I know what silence is. And this is a quote that hopefully helps us. But it says, silence is regenerative practice of attending and listening to God in quiet, without interruption and noise. Silence provides freedom from speaking, as well as from listening to words and music. So it is being quiet before the Lord. It's actually, I think, when we approach silence and solitude in the way that I'm thinking of it as a discipline, we actually approach God in quiet. And we don't actually speak. It's a form of prayer, but it's not the speaking kind of prayer. And I do think that it actually, silence includes silencing that internal noise that we've all got within us. All that stuff that's going round and round in our minds, the worries we've got, or the ambitions we've got, or whatever it is. All of that internal noise that goes, the mental chatter, if you like. the what-ifs and the hypothetical scenarios that we often have going around in our minds. And it's actually that's the hardest bit, is to quieten that and still that so that we can hear the voice of God. I like this quote from Susan Muto. It says, "In a noise-polluted world, it's even difficult to hear ourselves think, let alone try to be still and know God. Yet it seems essential for our spiritual life to seek some silence, no matter how busy we may be. Silence is not to be shunned as empty space, but to be befriended as fertile ground for intimacy with God." So that's silence. So thinking about solitude, here's a definition for you. The practice of solitude involves scheduling enough uninterrupted time in a distraction-free environment that you're alone with God and experience His presence. That's what it means. And so obviously silence and solitude go together in that sense. And I think it is just more than being alone. It's being alone without distractions. So it is shutting off the computers and the phones and all the rest of it. So you can actually be quiet with God and come into His presence. But let me say that I know that for many people, solitude can be a scary sort of idea, really. And what it isn't, I think, is it's not isolation. You know, we experience that in lockdown. It's not that. It's not loneliness. Loneliness is when we are almost forced into being alone, and we don't want to be, and it becomes dangerous for us. I love that. John Mark Cohen was always very wise, and he says this: solitude is engagement, isolation is escape. And sometimes I think what he's saying there is sometimes we can become isolated for the wrong reasons. You know, sometimes we just want to get away from people or stuff, and there's a sense that's all right, but it's not. This practice is not about that. It's not about escaping. It's about engaging. It's wanting to engage with the presence of God. He says solitude is safety, but isolation is danger. Solitude is how you open yourself up to God. Isolation is painting a target on your back for the tempter. That's brilliant, isn't it? Let me read that again. Solitude is how you open yourself up to God. Isolation is painting a target on your back for the tempter. And you know that, Peter, isn't it, I think, that says about Satan being like a roaring lion, looking for somebody to devour. And you know how the big cats get their prey is they isolate the weakest. That's what they do. They get them away from the herd. And that's not what solitude is. That's isolation, and that's danger. He says solitude is when you set aside time to feed and water and nourish your soul, to let it grow into health and maturity. But isolation is what you crave when you neglect the former. Think about that, it's wise. So, I would say solitude, or the practice of solitude, is not being alone, because we're not alone. We're coming into God's presence. That's what we're seeking. So it's actually it's enabling time to be present to the presence. Okay, so it's being present to the presence when we practice it well. I need just a sip of water. Are you with me so far? Good. Okay. So let's think about some. Isolation is not. That's not isolation or loneliness. So some barriers we may face in practicing silence and solitude. Firstly, it might be our nature, and I do get that. You know, for extroverts, silence and solitude seems a very difficult thing to do. For introverts, it's probably easier, and there's a balance to all these practices. Next time, we're going to think about the practice of living in community. So the extroverts can next week go, yay! But this, you know, I do think even for extroverts, you need a certain amount of time on your own in quiet and listening. When you think about it, so we've talked about the practice of Jesus, but my feeling as I read the Gospels about Jesus is that he's a bit of an extrovert, actually. You know, he was renowned for going to parties, wasn't he? You know, the Pharisees and teachers of the law criticised him for always being at parties and stuff. And there's that occasion when, in John 4, when he meets the woman at the well at Sychar, You know the story. And it says that these disciples have gone off to find food and Jesus is left alone at the well. And it says that he's tired. That's what it says. And then, the woman comes along to draw some water at the quiet time because she's a disgrace and, she comes on her own so nobody else is about. If it was me, I might have, if I'm tired, being an introvert like I am, she might have just got a quick shalom. But no, Jesus starts engaging her in conversation. And you know how it goes. She talks all about his past and, gives prophetic words and leads it to himself, really. That's the behaviour of an extrovert when you're tired and start engaging people in conversations. So if Jesus has, and he's probably nuanced in terms of extrovert introvert stuff, but okay. But if he had to spend these times of quiet, then no matter how extrovert you are, you need to do this practice. So there is something about our nurture, I think, sometimes can be a barrier. If you grew up in a house or in an environment that was particularly noisy, there's always noise around, then that can be very difficult to then later in life engage with quiet. I get that. And sometimes as well, isolation is used as a punishment, isn't it, for kids? Go to your room, and particularly if you're a bit of an extrovert, that's quite a heavy punishment, really. So sometimes we can still, I think, for some of us, we may have that link to actually solitude means punishment, and then of course the practice becomes very hard, but it isn't that. And if any of these things are still around from your past, then Jesus can heal all of these things. But sometimes it can isolate, from our childhood, it can feel like rejection, or it can feel a dangerous place, it can feel a place of punishment. So that can be a barrier. Sometimes we might have in the past been subject to abuse of silence. But what I mean by that is we might have had somebody do some very fearful thing to us, surprising us, jumping us when we're kids in a time of quiet. So then silence becomes a place of danger. It becomes a place of where I was frightened. And some of this stuff we might even be aware of, but it might be some of the reasons why we don't engage with it, or we run away from it. Feeling unproductive. That can be another thing that, actually just sitting in quiet on our own, that seems like a waste of time, doesn't it? I mean, come on. We should be doing something, shouldn't we? But actually in life, often things aren't what they seem. And this practice in its healthy way, in doing it in a healthy way of silence and solitude, is actually really, 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 really productive. Because it draws, if you allow it to draw us into the presence of God. And I'll talk about some of the benefits in a minute. So don't think that this is a waste of time. If Jesus did it, it can't be, can it? I mean, it's not a waste of time. Sometimes we don't do it because we're running from ourselves. In other words, what I mean is if we're afraid that if we spend time on our own with God, we're kind of worried about what might actually come up, and we don't, stuff we might not really want to deal with, and so we run away from it. Now I get that, but Jesus and the Spirit and the Father are so gentle with us and they're so kind to us that yes, they will bring up stuff sometimes, but it's always done in the way that's right for us in that moment. He never takes us too far in the moment. It's a process we're all on. So don't run away from it. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous German pastor killed by the Nazis. He said this: "We are so afraid of silence that we chase ourselves from one event to the next, in order not to have a moment alone with ourselves, in order not to have a look at ourselves in the mirror." And sometimes, if we're honest, it's true. That's what we do. We just keep running from something to something to something, keeping ourselves occupied because we're afraid of what the silence might actually throw up. But it does heal us in the end. Sloth, I thought I had to mention this. After that wonderful talk, and Tom very helpfully posted it on the WhatsApp group. We were there, of course, to listen to Charles Montgomery's talk about sloth, and if you haven't listened to it yet, it's gold. Listen to it. It's absolutely fantastic. But one of the things that can stop us doing, actually, silence and solitude is hard work. It's not easy to do it. And so sometimes it's just we're too lazy. So we sloth takes over and we think, oh no, I'll just look at my phone, or I'll put some music on or something, or the television. Don't be lazy. Work at it. It'll reap its benefits for you. And our culture, of course, is also another key thing. I can't remember, I put this quote up. But, our culture is very noisy. All our gadgets, our machinery, it's actually quite hard often to find silence. Even if you want to look for it, there's so much noise around us. Yeah, I did put this up. Yeah, this is from C.S. Lewis's. He's so insightful, C.S. Lewis. But this is from his book, Screwtape Letters. Where there's a senior devil talking to a junior devil, and at one point he says this. This is Screwtape, the senior devil, talking to his partner. The devil's realm is a kingdom of noise, and we will make the whole universe a noise in the end. And our culture is doing its best to get there. So yeah, it's not easy in our culture. So those are some of the barriers. Our nature, our nurture, the sense of feeling, this is just a waste of time, it's unproductive, running from self, sloth, and our culture. So we're going to talk about the benefits now as we close. Let me know, I just need another swig of water. So here, as I read it, the benefits of doing this. The first thing is learning to listen. I think it's actually part of our culture that we've become less practiced at listening. Nobody wants to listen anymore. We want to just give our opinions. Twitter, give our opinions, and we don't want to listen anymore. But listening is a vital skill, and it's something we need to practice. And silence and solitude helps us do that, because all we've got left is listening. That's all there is in the silence and solitude is just focusing our attention on listening. And I really do believe that's, if you were to ask me one of the reasons why I and the church generally are less effective in ministry than we could be, it's because we don't know how to do that. We don't know how to listen. Jesus said his ministry was seeing what the Father's doing. He said, I just do what the Father's doing. Now, sometimes that is seeing. We can actually see something. We can see the Spirit on somebody. But most of the time, it's listening. Jesus was a master listener to his Father. He knew exactly what he was to do, what he wasn't to do, because he spent that time in solitude. He learned to listen to the voice. And listening in the moments of quiet then enables you to listen in the moments when there's a lot of stuff going on around you. You're still in tune with that voice. But you can only do that through the practice of silence and solitude. So if you want to get better at ministry, and I guess we're all put our hands up to that, then we need to learn to listen. And this practice helps us to do that. And also to other people as well. It's a dying art just to be able to listen to someone with proper attention. Because our attention spans in this digital age, there's attention spans of a gnat, really. None of us can focus very long. So silence and solitude helps you to do that. It really does. It sets us free, I think, from negative patterns and habits of speech. But the fact that we are having to be silent and not talking is really good for us. It really is. It stops things, if we practice it well, it'll stop things like gossip, impulsive chatter, the need to express our opinions all the time. Isn't this the culture we're in? Attention seeking through talking. Learning when to be quiet. Learning not to process things aloud, because some of us do that. We actually process our thoughts by speaking and then wish sometimes we hadn't, because we've said something we shouldn't have done. So all of these, there's so many negative habits of speech we can have. And I'll tell you this, there's more damage done in the church and in the Christian world through the fact that we've not learned how to tame our tongues, as James rightly said, than anything else. We just don't know when to stop or when to say the right thing. When is the right thing to say something? Now, all of us are on this learning process, and I'm not there. I'm not pointing the finger. I know I do it myself. Sometimes I interrupt. A moment of silence is just waiting to get in and say something. I need to learn to shut up more. I love this. This is one of the best verses and most neglected verses in the New Testament. My dear brothers and sisters, says James, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Memorise it, remember it. We'll all be better off if we do. Okay, so got a few more of these. We can go through them quicker, hopefully. Freedom from noise addiction. Actually, there is such a thing as noise addiction. Some of us just cannot bear to be quiet. And, it's not for all of us, but some of us, we're just addicted to noise. And so this practice really helps us to become free from that. We can become comfortable with the quiet and the presence of God. Deeper intimacy with God, I guess that goes without saying, really, that it's really a key to intimacy with God. It allows him to do that deeper work in us. In the silence, he raises things with us, and we respond to them. And often it's also just about, in his presence, we just come under, again, that sense of his love. To experience his love, you have to be quiet and let him tell you. Let him whisper it to you, because that's often how it is. And it's not only just stuff about us in intimacy, but it's also stuff about him. And we begin to receive that deeper work in receiving his presence. Receiving healing quietness. I actually do believe, and I've got a verse to back this up, I'll be pleased to know. I believe there's something healing about quiet. When we get to that place where we're comfortable with it, it's that sort of the stopping of noise and chaos, the demands, the slowing down, the resetting that all goes on in the quiet. This is my verse. This is from Isaiah 30. It says, "This is what the sovereign Lord says. The Holy One of Israel says, in repentance and rest is your salvation. In quietness and trust is your strength." Salvation is all about wholeness. He says, quietness and trust is your strength, but you would have none of it. Isaiah says to the Israelite people, you would have none of it. And sometimes that's what God's saying to us. You just won't have it. You won't have it. You won't come into my presence in quiet. So there's a healing quietness. Self-awareness, both the good and the bad, really, that we get from being quiet with God. We do need to be more self-aware, to know what our weaknesses and strengths are. And I think it's in the silence and the solitude that we come to that place of identity, knowing the things we still need to work on, but also knowing the things that God wants to affirm, because he will affirm stuff in the quiet. He will affirm stuff about you. So becoming self-aware, freedom from the need to be occupied and stimulated. That's often something that we just want somebody to. It's like kids, kids they have to be occupied or stimulated or do something with me, all this. And we big kids are often just the same, really. That we need something to stimulate us or occupy us, or and actually. It's good to have those moments when we don't need that. We just come to the presence of God. Liberation. Solitude is good because it liberates us from living in reference to others. What I mean is it can start to break that habit of any bad dependencies, either for us on other people. We need such and such a person, or we need, and it brings us into dependency on God the Father himself. Or it frees us from being depended upon, those people that kind of need us and we feel, that they've got to have us in our presence. And solitude is great because it frees us from all of that. It frees us from those tyrannies of having to be somebody or live up to some expectation or pretend with people or whatever. It strips us all back, it strips us down to being who we are before God, who knows and sees everything anyway. So I do think it will help us from those bad dependencies that we sometimes have towards others, or from being depended upon. Some of us like to be depended upon, and we like the attention of other people and being needed, and that's not healthy sometimes, and God needs to sometimes break it through periods of silence and solitude. We're nearly there. Freedom from achieving and producing. I said it's good sometimes not to have to achieve anything, or not. I mean, I find that a brilliant freedom, actually. That, there's a moment I can just speak before God, and there's nobody else around. I don't have to be pastor. I don't have to be producing something. I don't have to be producing a talk, or I can just sit with him, and it's a blessing. And some of us are addicted to achieving, producing, being effective, whatever. If our identities, particularly if we're type A type people, and our identity is tied up with what we do, this is a wonderful way of freeing us from it. Okay. And lastly, just speaking what we hear from God. Not speaking out of the store of our opinions or what we feel is right, but actually listening to God and only saying what we hear he's telling us to say. So, I think I'm just about done, but just finally, let me just say one or two practical things. If you're starting out on this, for some of you may be all ready to spend a week in a Trappist monastery with a week in silence with a load of Trappist monks. I'm not there, but maybe that if you are, that's great. If you feel comfortable. But for many of us, we need to start small. So if this is something new for you, what I would say is try 15 minutes each day. And that's without the worship music on, okay? For some, without the worship music, without a Bible in front of you. Those things can be useful in leading you in, but you need to put them down, put the quiet on, and just be with God. Do it for 15 minutes. See if you can build that up. My aim is to get to an hour a day doing it. I'm not there yet, but that's my aim. Do a task in silence. If you're doing something, rather than having the television on or the radio going, if you're just cleaning or something, just do it in silence. That can be a help. Go for a walk if that helps. But do it where you hopefully won't meet people. And if you're out for a silent walk and you see me, you have permission to say quickly hello, go away. And what I would say also is remember that with all of these practices, when we started out with them, I said remember the J curve, because what happens the J curve is like a figure J. That often when you start a practice, it feels actually negative, it feels worse until you have to persevere with it. Like all of these practices, often you feel worse for a start until you start going back up. So sometimes, you'll try it and you feel negative about it. Maybe it didn't quite work very well. There's lots of stuff going on. Just persevere with it, and don't be hard on yourself if you find it hard to start with. Yeah, I think I'm done. I'm gonna finish with Mr. Comer again. Why not? Find the right page. Okay. So this is John Mark Comer talking about this practice of silence and solitude. He says this. He says, as I see it, we have two options. Option A, we neglect this practice, make excuses, get sucked into the rat race, and face emotional unhealth at best, and spiritual oblivion at worst. Pretty heavy, Mark, but John Mark. But, or he says B, we can recapture this ancient yet timely practice and experience the life of Jesus. And he says a bit all in between, but then he concludes, he says, my fellow denizens of a frazzled digital generation, let's go with option B.